high-minded as opposed to low-minded, to have high moral standards as opposed to low moral standards. Ask yourself where they came from. Nietzsche was the first man to force himself to consider the possibility that what we take to be universal moral distinctions applicable to everyone are in fact a disguised form of the will to power, a way for the weak and the impotent to get back at the superior by changing these aristocratic valuations, by moving from good and bad to good and evil. In other words, the invention of evil was a way for the oppressed to strike back at the superior. Nietzsche wants to erase that. He says that's a mistake in Western culture. That's it's a hole or a gap or an inferior part of the Western tradition. And if we want to produce superior human beings, then we have to free them from the shackles of slave morality. We have to prevent them from being undermined in their achievements or undermined in their aspirations by creating in them the conscience, a conscience which prevents them from achieving what they could. Now here's another very interesting question, and it's very hard to answer. Nietzsche offers us a very provocative conception. Where does conscience come from, and what is it? Think about that for a moment. If, in fact, human beings are animals, and I think that Darwin has conclusively shown that to be the case, why are we the only animal with a conscience, and where does it come from, and what is it? Very difficult question. Nietzsche's argument is something like this. Human beings have a natural desire to achieve power. They have the will to power. That is characteristic of what makes people go. And the usual route that the will to power takes is the desire to dominate other people. There is a natural ruthlessness in people, a desire to take advantage of others, and it pleases people to cause pain. Hard thing for us to swallow perhaps in these days, but with the degree of pain in the world and the degree of evil that we see, to use a word that I might italicize, there may well be something to it. If, in fact, people do like to create pain in others, of course, usually not themselves, what happens when you frustrate this desire? What happens when you say, you can't enslave other people, you can't kill other people and take their possessions, you can't oppress other people because we will stop you? Well, Nietzsche says, and this is a fascinating possibility, although I'm not certain if it's true, he says that when people are frustrated in their desire to cause pain to others, the consequence of that is that they decide to start imposing pain on themselves. And this pain that they impose on themselves is called conscience. A horrifying possibility. In German, the term for the pang of conscience is called Gewissenbisse, which means the bite of conscience. And Nietzsche says essentially that people are predatory animals, and if they can't bite other people, they bite themselves. And when they begin to torture themselves, they find the last possible outlet for this desire to impose pain on the world. If they can't do it to other people, they'll do it to themselves. Now, this bite of conscience gets progressively worse when priests come on the scene, when the priestly type comes on the scene. It goes from inferior to even more inferior, because the priests harness slave morality, they harness this morality of the herd, and they use it for their own purposes. The priests are the highest example of the herd animal, of the herd type. They have a special set of morals that they keep for themselves, and then they rule the herd using various kinds of myths and various kinds of verbal techniques so that they can have their revenge, and so that they can oppose the warrior type. Nietzsche sees among the highest types of human beings an intrinsic conflict between the priest and the warrior. Nietzsche thinks that the warrior is the kind of person that knows how to forget things. Again, this is an interesting psychological profile. And there are many, incidentally, if you read The Genealogy of Morals and Beyond Good and Evil, you'll find that there are many anticipations of Freud. Especially the question of conscience and the question of resentment. Nietzsche thinks that resentment, the hatred of being oppressed, is the source of slave moralities, and that the priest takes that resentment, formulates it in a mythological way, and uses that to orchestrate and control the herd so that they can be opposed to any superiority among those that would break moral rules, among the would-be warriors. Now, what makes the priestly type so dangerous? is the fact that they can dominate culture and that they have chosen the wrong path. They have chosen the slave moralities and they have absolutized that. The consequence of absolutizing that is that it seems that there is no possibility of reintroducing master morality without a complete and thoroughgoing critique of the culture, and that is what Nietzsche thinks he is. That's what it means for Nietzsche to be the Antichrist. He's not just the Antichrist in some mythological sense. He literally takes that as a mark of distinction. It shows just what a free thinker he is. Nietzsche is willing to say not only is he the Antichrist, but that he thinks that that's the best development in culture since the time of Jesus. It's about time that we got back to a morality which would allow for the development of superior people. Now, Nietzsche's argument here is very disturbing. It's disturbing in its consequences. It's disturbing because it kind of rocks the moral boat for us. But Nietzsche's critique goes even further than this. He wants to investigate not just the question of pain and people's desire to impose pain on others, and if not on others, then on themselves. He wants to look at the arguments about suffering made by the priests. Christianity, if you remember, holds the view that God is providential, that he supervises the entire world, and then I believe the phrase is, not a sparrow falls, but God knows about it. Well, Nietzsche thinks that this myth was invented so that suffering could be justified and could be explained. And in some respects, there's a certain amount of truth in that part of what Christianity does is explain, or at least explain away, the fact of human suffering by saying that God doubtless has some plan, although we don't know what that plan is, it surely is there because the kind of God we've decided to construct, the kind of God we believe in, is the kind of God, is a good God, a loving God, the kind of God that would never do anything evil. Since he would never do anything evil, the suffering that you get must have a meaning. And Nietzsche thinks the worst thing that the priestly element ever did to human culture was to sell people on the idea that suffering has meaning. Nietzsche says that the entire world is completely meaningless, that the world is moral chaos, that suffering has no meaning, and the idea that suffering has meaning just makes suffering infinitely worse. It's not hard to see why. It was bad when weak, feeble people had to put up with the strong, had to put up with with having things stolen from them, with being murdered and raped and tortured. That was bad because of simple physical pain, for the reason that any natural calamity is bad. But the priestly idea of attaching a meaning to this suffering makes it all that much worse. Because if there is a God in heaven who is in fact supervising this entire procedure, the reason why suffering must follow us, why evil must befall us, lies in ourselves. We are somehow responsible for it. We brought it upon ourselves. What does this mean? This infinitely increases our suffering because not only are the weak and the feeble still being tortured and killed and raped and maimed, but in addition to that, it's their fault. What a horrible turnaround. What a dreadful addition to the suffering they already have. After you recover from a terrible encounter with warrior aristocrats, with those who are beyond good and evil, then you must live with the fact that you brought it on yourself, and guilt enters the world. After the superior, after the strong, after the ruthless have finished with you, after they've caused their modicum of pain, you have to add to it. The bite of conscience means you're going to impose pain on yourself. This development is one of the worst turning points in the history of Western culture, according to Nietzsche. And in that respect, Nietzsche believes that he is liberating us from the shackles of a self-imposed misery. And for all his madness, there is a certain degree of coherence in this argument. And it is hard to know where he's correct, how much of this we should accept, and how much of it is just speculation that we could never really have much of an idea about. So let's stop and think about it for a second. My suspicion is that Nietzsche is probably wrong in his argument that good and bad come, or that our judgments of good and bad and good and evil come from the distinction exclusively of masters and slaves. Probably the distinction between good and bad is much older than aristocratic social structures, which are relatively late in human development, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 BC for the most part. What it most likely is attached to is feelings of pleasure and pain. My guess is, again, just speculating a la Nietzsche, we should be very much in the Nietzschean tradition, that probably a full stomach was a good feeling and going hungry was a bad feeling. Probably breaking your leg was a bad feeling and being healthy was a good feeling. And these